Welcome home, my little hellhounds. Tonight we have 2 scary stories to sink our hellish teeth into. If you have any scary stories you want narrated on the channel, then submit them to Reddit r/homeofscares and follow me on Twitter at homeofscares. Also, if you like this content, then don't forget to subscribe, and if you'll be so kind and click that like button and the bell icon so you get notified every time I upload. Now let's get right into it. Beware of what lurks in the forest beyond the tree line. Posted by Don Quixote Rosie. How do I explain this? If I tell you, will you please believe me? I hope you will. Call me crazy, call me sane, call me a believer, call me an attention seeker. Call me whatever you please. It is only due to other experiences that I have had the courage to post this in the No Sleep community. But I beg of you to listen to what I have to tell you, because they're real. They're very real as my shaking hands as I write this. The things, the creatures that inhabit the forest at night. It all started when I decided to go to a survival camp that would last 10 days. We met at the campground with a group of 5 other survivalists and a group leader and his assistant. They would stay with us for 3 days and show us techniques, things like set up a tent, how to identify local flora that was edible, and how to set traps, etc. Each of us were given a backpack with items that you would commonly carry while on a hike, like chapstick, binoculars, some protein bars, a lighter and matches. We were allowed to bring 1 personal item, and my choice was a hatchet. For 3 days our group did several things. We used the river to get water, which we liked boiled for 15 minutes to kill anything in the water. There are a few natural springs in the area that you can drink fresh, and the guides showed us these. We learned how to make lean too, how to use rock walls to make a shelter with fire heating it up to keep warm, how to build hammocks out of kudzu vines, what wild strawberries look like, along with several other things. They did not show us mushrooms, as these are easily misidentified, so they don't chance that for legal reasons, but the puffball ones are the only ones they allowed us to pick, as they are easily identifiable. We also made traps like snares and rock falls, along with making fishing line out of kudzu vines and makeshift hooks, or finding fish in quiet zones of the creek where you could trap trout. We learned how to make fire with binocular glass, matches and lighter, and proper TP builds for your kindling. After the 3 days we were let go on our own. You would stay at base camp and the leader would walk you several miles into the undergrowth. Each of us were taken at different times and given a satellite radio in case we had an emergency. So we set off on our own and made it the best of it. The group leaders would stay at base and wait 5 days, then come get you. Day 1, nothing out of the ordinary. I set a few traps, built a decent lean-to on the side of a large boulder. Fire is doing a solid job of heating the rock wall to keep it pretty warm inside. The air was crisp, but not quite cold. Some drizzle, but no deluges. I'm close enough to the river that I only need to walk 70 yards or so. I'm not quite up the mountains, but on somewhat of a hill surrounded by pawpaw rhododendrons that are starting to bloom, catalpa and several conifers. I eat half of a protein bar and collected quite a few plants. First night is quiet. I only hear a few things out in the forest. It's very dark outside. The firelight I've collected enough wood to keep any critters at bay, namely black bears, as they can be curious. I was awoken at some point in the night by the sat phone. Another survivalist is complaining about some large animal walking around his campground. Seems to believe it's a bear, but it sounds like it's walking on 2 legs. Never says anything else the rest of the night. Night goes without an incident, but I will say, earlier I did find tracks that looked human, but were indicative of a Bigfoot, as the footprint wasn't formed quite like ours. I wear a size 12 boot. This I put my foot into the print, and it was a solid 5 inches longer. Now there are stories of wild man in this part of the country. I brushed the stories off until I saw that print, and from night 1's sat cool. Night 3 is when everything went to shit. Around 1 AM is when I started questioning things. When a large rock hit the back of my lean-to, I figured it was from the boulder and something simply broke off, as rock slides are common around here. After that woke me up, I grabbed the flashlight and assessed the damage. I rolled the boulder off the shelter and it wasn't too far from breaking it completely. I half-assed fixed it and figured I'd just fix it in the morning. I'd caught a rabbit in a snare and I cleaned it not far from the camp, I'd say 100 yards off. That was when I heard it, a rattling sound similar to that of a rattlesnake. I shined the light that way, and that was when I saw it. It had black fur, a nightmarish red eyes, giving it the look and style of a predatory black panther. It had a dark feral appearance. It had the body of a massive tiger, with a tail with scales at the end that shook to produce the rattling sounds, similar to that of rattlesnakes. Its eyes glue a bright red, and leaving trails of reddish lines as it moved through the trees, watching me. It moved towards me carefully and cautiously, just when I thought I was done for something. Screamed. It sounded like a gorilla when it gets angry, followed by a chuffing sound, like when a dog has drank too much water. The deep in the throat, like it's clearing it out. I turned back where I flashed my light and the creature was gone. I stood there, frozen, in this tiny clearing, thinking a bear is finishing off the entrails if the rabbit I cleaned earlier. I have no weapons other than my hatchet and pocket knife. I come out of my trance and walk over to my backpack, never taking my eyes off the wood line. Everything in the night is quiet. I only hear the river running and the logs crackling. I sit down with my hatchet and throw one more log onto the fire, hoping that it gets large and high enough to keep anything at bay. I sit for maybe 30 minutes and I'm kinda of dozing off. Then another rock comes hurling from the left side of the forest and falls 10 yards away. I know the boulder didn't do this based on where the rock came from. Now I'm panicking. I stand up, hoping to make myself look large with my shadow on the boulder behind me. I hear the chuffing again, and smaller trees further in the clearing, clearly moving back and forth rather quickly. I can see a large black shape moving around the firelight just at the edge of the end of the light, 40 yards in maybe. I can hear this thing breaking limbs, crushing leaves with every step. The thing was at least 8 foot tall if I had to guess. It had long black hair and terrifying sharp teeth, but it was pretty far away from where I was. It's slowly moving away, but I could tell where the thing's head was watching me, as every now and again I'd see eye shine. It flashed its teeth like a baboon by folding its lips back and then walked away further into the woods, and the sounds started getting fainter and fainter, and I could hear it go up into the river and cross it. The loud shh, shh sound from the water as it crossed were only a few steps. It was about 20 foot across the river at this point. I sat back down and contemplated what to do. It was around 2 a.m. and I have a few hours till daylight. I don't want to walk the 4 miles back in the dark in a place I'm not familiar with. Fast forward 2 hours. It's 4ish a.m. The sat phone turns on and the guy is screaming into it. Something is trying to kill me. I've had several rocks thrown at me. A large man is outside my shelter. I can hear it. This isn't a bear. I don't know what it is, but I need help. Silence. 15 minutes. 20 minutes go by. Another guy comes on. Something did that to me last night, but I thought it was a bear. I stayed here thinking I knew what it was. Rocks weren't thrown though, but I could hear it walking the perimeter of my camp. It's close to 5 a.m. now. If I can make it a few hours until daylight, I'm fine. All the forest sounds have returned. I'm still waiting. Around 7:15, and check my backpack to see if I could find my radio. And it's gone. I start to panic because the sun isn't quite up yet, but that eerie dawn light is filling the land and the clearing is still pretty dark. I start gathering my things and start putting the fire out with dirt around the pit and start to walk. I figure I have no choice at this point. As I'm walking, I hear something mimicking my footsteps. I stopped, and just before I put my foot down, I heard leaves crumble behind me. I ran as fast as I could, deeper into the woods, losing my sense of direction. About 10 minutes into running, I see a cabin. I run in and I slam the door behind me, placing everything I could in front of it. I'm writing this now, but out of my window I can see it showing its teeth to me like a baboon, trying to intimidate another animal with its glowing eyes, just watching me. It's slowly walking around to the front door, running its massive hands across the outside of the cabin. It's beating the door down. I don't have much time left. Please, if you go into the forest, whether it be for a camping trip or hiking, beware of what lurks beyond the tree line. My housemate was a genius. I don't regret burning him alive. Posted by Toucan the Rapper. I'm pretty sure I lived with a literary genius, a once-in-a-generation mind akin to Dickens or Shakespeare, with contents as dangerous as Robert Oppenheimer's or Salman Rushdie's, whereas Dickens and Shakespeare helped shape the world though. Roy Bardequit would have no doubt ended it. Roy's stories and poems had readers laughing, crying, enraged, even sleeping at his whim. He'd set out a goal, then created a string of vowels and syllables with which he played his readers' hearts like musical instruments. His romance poetry had the most reserved of folk spontaneously professing undying love to bemused, soon-to-be sweethearts. His tale of nation-forging heroism on the battlefield inspired more than one lad to drop out of university and enlist. His dramas, thematically exploring death and loss, left none who poured through them with dry eyes. Those times weren't what made me burn down our student accommodation while he was still inside though. No. It was the stories he wrote after deciding he wanted to make people scream which did that. I've been in prison for a few years now, arson and murder, in case you were wondering. This is it for me. It's worth it though. I may be legally guilty, but my soul carries the weight of zero regrets. Sure, you can agree with the shrink and call me a walking delusional martyr complex. I don't care. I know my life beyond bars is a sacrifice I've made for the good of humanity. Fuck knows what would have happened if those stories were ever published. As I said, Roy had a way with words. I met him in the first year, his room being next to mine in our flat. By the second, he and I were moving into a shared house with two others, Lisa and Ted, and coincidentally, the latter's testimony to my outstanding character managed to knock all of 2 years off my sentence. Throughout our friendship, I could tell that Roy was different. No, not different. Different is the wrong word. Gifted. Yeah, let's go with that. He was gifted in a way that few have the privilege of encountering. At first I felt lucky to know him. Word about the tall guy in the duffel coat who made the famous guest lecturer break down into floods of tears got around quickly. I don't want to reveal her name because I don't want any media hassle caused by a show trial when they sue me for defamation. The public hate me too much for it not to be used to add another decade to my stretch. If the words vampire baseball mean anything to you, you'll be familiar with her work. Roy broke her after accusing her of being, in his words, a peddler of emotionally empty pig swill. That's an insult to the trees which died for the paper it's printed on. When she had challenged him to do better, he pulled out a napkin. He wrote a haiku. I never read it, but I saw the video of the famous guest lecturer reading it once, twice, and then throwing herself on the floor in hysterics. I laughed with Roy as she ran out of the room in the clip wailing, "It's too beautiful, it's too beautiful," over and over again, while the lecture hall howled and cackled along with us. And so it continued for the first 6 months or so. Roy would have drama and English lit girls falling over him. I'd be there with the closest available bed to his asexual brand of impenetrable genius. That all changed after the incident though. It shocked the whole campus. About 6 or 7 lads, none of them an underage visitor, only down for the weekend, died at an after party. Not died in a quiet yet tragic way either. They died in the kind of way that meant journalists swarmed around our campus for a solid 2 months. The kind of way that caused over 3 dozen students to drop out the next day. One had killed 2 of the others, one jumped out of a window, and there were rumours that 2 survivors, so traumatised, they mutilated themselves. Nobody knows what exactly happened, but the university staff couldn't stop the photographs of the bloodshed and carnage left behind from being circulated around various WhatsApp and Facebook groups. I never saw the pictures myself. The sight of my future housemate, Ted, looking at his phone and instantly projectile vomiting across the room was enough for me to know my relatively squeamish stomach couldn't take it. I wish Roy had shown the same restraint. Probably a bad batch of acid or something, Ted had said, while Roy gazed at the phone in his hands. Either that or the others snapped when they saw what Luke did. I heard he cut their... Could you send me these? Ted was as surprised by Roy's sudden interruption as I was. Yeah, sure, he replied, shooting me a sidelong glance as he took the phone back from Roy. What do you want them for though, buddy? Research, Roy muttered, already heading to his room. He had that face on, the face he always wore the night before handing in an assignment, which summoned gaggles of fawning female admirers to our flat. I should have twigged then that no good could come from that face mixing with those photos. I was too stoned at the time though, and too content to get back to my Tekken match with Ted to worry about the activities of our pet genius. I didn't realise, but that night was the start of the 9-month countdown, which would end with Roy dead, our flat burned to the ground, and me, the monster of the week in the papers. The first 3 months were pretty unremarkable, if I'm honest. The first changes were in the fawning groupies Roy would attract to our living room. Guys started to appear alongside them, initially at least. The overall vibe of his acolytes changed too, whereas before he'd lured bouncy art chicks, the tone of his ensemble relegant, until I was trying to see Tekken over the shoulders of the goth girls and sunken-eyed wannabe Lovecrafts. However, after the first month or two, this crowd started to shrink. The dwindling numbers of curvy goths and dishevelled imitators were increasingly harrowed, worried looks on their faces, the same expressions that the drama and literature girls I used to wake up with had worn when Roy's new artistic direction drove them away. I found out why about 3 months in. Roy was once more locked in his room, halfway through a days-long writing session. "What's going on with him?" I asked Ted, jerking a thumb over my shoulder in the direction of Roy's room. "I know. He was always a shut-in, but I've not seen him since Thursday. He stopped bringing girls over too." "Yes, because that's what we should be concerned about," Lisa butted in before Ted could reply, rolling her eyes. "God forbid Rick, the engineering student, doesn't get laid." Haha, I let out a wry laugh. "Yes, Lisa, very good, you got me. You figured out it was that I hid the body in the floorboards." We all laughed at the in-joke for a few moments, then Ted finally answered my question. "I dunno, Rick, mate. In all honesty, he's been off since those photos from that night in G Block. The one with Luke McAllis." "I know the one you mean, dumbass. That hit everyone though. You can't tell me all his friends, I guess, from his classes dropped out." Lisa shook her head. "No, they're still there. Us journals have a shared lecture with the creative writing guys. Travel writing, Roy's stuff lately. Ted, Rick, I think something's actually wrong with him." Lisa was leaning forward in the beaten up living room chair, pleased she finally had an attentive audience for her concerns. The conversation lasted long into the night. It ended about 2 a.m. with the three of us stood outside Roy's bedroom. "Roy," I hazarded, knocking softly on the door. "Roy, it's Rick, Ted and Lisa are with me." Lisa was saying, "Ow." Lisa jabbed me on the arm. She was shaking her head, eyes wide and afraid, crossing her open palms in the air to tell me to stum. "I mean, you remember Rachel, that girl from your course I got with?" "That narrows it down," Ted chuckled quietly, prompting Lisa to deliver another shut-up arm jab. I rolled my eyes at Ted and kept speaking to Roy through the door. Well, buddy, I tried to catch up with her and invite her over, but she says she's concerned, worried, scared. Lisa nodded at me when I said the last one. Yeah, she's scared, Roy. She said the stuff you've been reading in lectures recently has been... Well, can we talk? I finished my speech, delivered in the same semi-condescending tone folk use when reprimanding 13 or 14-year-olds who try to experience adulthood too early. There was a grunt from the other side of the door, but Roy didn't respond. This time Lisa piped up. It's not just Rachel, Roy. Loads of your class have told me the stories you're writing are too much. People are on the edge after the whole G-Block incident, you know. The response from the door's other side was clipped and impatient. Not my problem. If they were happy to kiss my ass when it was mushy romance fuck stories or deep poetry, they should be happy to keep their lips on there when I'm trying to scare them. The three of us jumped. We hadn't heard Roy's footsteps, so it took us all completely by surprise when his bedroom door swung inwards. As soon as the M in them left his lips, he stood in the doorway grinning at us. Under his bloodshot eyes were deep purple bags. The room beyond was dark, save for the piercing glare of the laptop screen. What do you want? His gaze darted between the three of us. Although it hung around Lisa's nervous features a fraction longer than mine or Ted's. You want me to stop? Write something different? Go back to making the girls cross their legs and the boys jot down notes? All three of us in the hallway took a step back, but it was Lisa that spoke. No, Roy, it's just... Look, that piece you read last week in the travel writing lecture, the one about the blue desert, you mean, that I read about in... Yes, that one, Lisa shuddered, cutting Roy off. It freaks the fuck out of me, Roy, and pretty much everyone else in the class. I've been having nightmares about it. Rick's not wrong. A lot of the guys on your course have told me about some of the fucked up stuff you've read in other... Look, if they don't want to listen, they can leave the room. Roy's brow furrowed. His face didn't have a dash of concern, but nowhere near enough to distill the clear anger. I'll write what I want to write. Roy, a few months ago there was a bloodbath on our campus. You saw the photos like I did. Loads of people aren't okay. If you're not, you can let us know. Ted surprised both Lisa and myself with this. He placed a hand on Roy's shoulder, which was quickly brushed aside. I'm fine. I'm just trying different stuff. As I said, I never asked them to listen. Makes no difference to me. We stood blinking at the door after he slammed it for a good 30 seconds. Well, Ted eventually broke the silence. I'd say that went well, don't you? The rest of the term continued in much the same way until we all went home for the summer. When we returned the following September, we were again living with Roy, although this time in our own rented flat above a small local shop. This had already been arranged months before Roy's strange turn of behaviour. I found Lisa's protests annoying after a while. The constant messages in their private chat between the three of us. I got shirty with her more than once during the last couple of weeks in August. The agreement is already signed, my thumbs hammered, laying on the bed at my mum's place on one of the last nights I'd ever spend there. There's nothing we can do about it now. Besides, he keeps himself in his room and he's got the money for rent. Is he really going to be any trouble? Roy didn't say much to us when we moved in his belongings. I was disappointed to see he still had that same tired, wild-eyed look on his face. My hopes that sometime back at home with his people would reinvigorate him weren't answered. He had less with him than when he'd moved into our old student flat the prior September. Some loose bed sheets, a bin bag full of clothes, and we could smell from the hallway, and a couple of boxes he'd scrawled research on the side of it in thick black marker. It was the 3 months between September and that Christmas, once we'd settled into our new place and the second year of university, that life with Roy started taking a much steeper decline. The first oddity was Roy's grades started falling off, way off. He went from getting high 90s to single digits and a lot of C-me's. I found this out vicariously, of course, through Lisa, who found out through Rachel, who still wasn't returning my messages. One time, I'd managed to catch him on his daily journey from his room to the kitchen. "Hey buddy, you doing okay?" Lisa said the feedback you've been getting from the lecturers isn't so good. He stood in the kitchen for a good minute staring at me. All I could think of was how awful he looked. The bags under his eyes had doubled in their depth and darkness. More red blood vessels had joined the network of them around his pupils. Roy had always been thin and a little on the pale side, but now he was gaunt. His pasty cheeks hung from his face. His features drooped and wax-like. "I'm fine," he muttered, not really making eye contact. "I'm just not wasting my best stuff anymore. I'm working on something, saving the good stuff for that." "Okay mate, still, could you at least have a shower? I had a date the other night and she noticed the smell." Roy shrugged. Sure. He didn't have a shower, or at least not one that I ever heard him take. The smell never left, but at least it never got worse either. It was a constant, a faint yet persistent whiff of gasoline and burnt eggs that felt like it had sunk into the walls and carpet. I stopped trying to bring dates back to our place in the end. Ted and Lisa started dating about 2 months into that strange limbo period, so neither of them had the issue. Not that they didn't complain. More than once I'd catch both Ted or Lisa either hammering on Roy's door and yelling about the smell, or marching up and down the shared living spaces emptying cans of air freshener. In addition to the smell and his grades, the other weirdness was Roy's following. He slowly started to gain it back, despite only delivering half-finished work to his once adoring public. In the lecture halls, his new flock was different. They were odd, but not in the try-hard way the fawning goth chicks and sullen imitators of the previous year were. The people that started knocking on our door, letting themselves in and heading straight to Roy's room, weren't even students. That was the only common thread. They were men, women, some much older than us and others young enough that we debated phoning the police. If we were somewhere in the States where the age of consent is way higher, we would have done. I'll be honest, I don't think it was anything sexual. Sometimes the younger ones turned up with parents, fathers or mothers, or both. They always had the same furtive expression, whether they were the homeless ones who smelled like piss, or the rich ones in crisp suits and ties. By the time December rolled around, he'd sometimes have as many as 12 or 13 crammed into his tiny room at once. I'd listen at the door during these nightly meetings. This is how I know there was nothing sexual going on, although this wasn't as much of a relief as you'd think. In the grand scheme of things, I don't think it would have made what happened much worse. I couldn't hear exactly what was said, but all I ever heard was talking. Roy talking. He'd talk for hours on end, I assume reading from whatever the something he was working on was. Judging by what happened on the last night, before we once more returned home for a holiday break, I'd put money on my assumptions being right. I heard Lisa's scream before I'd seen anything. I'd been in my room getting a little stoned and playing Tekken after a long day learning about rivets and gears. I threw myself into the hall to see Lisa stood in the doorway opposite mine, screaming so loud neighbours started banging on the walls. There was a man stood in front of her, facing away from me. It was one of Roy's followers, one of the well-off ones in the crisp suits. Lisa was looking up at him, her face covered in tears, screaming as loud as she could on every exhale. I found out why her screams couldn't stop when I put my hand on the crisp blue suit shoulder. When the man turned around to face me, I started screaming with her. He had taken out his eyes. Wetness was running down his cheeks, just like Lisa's, although this wetness was a dark red crimson. Eyelids flapped uselessly in front of gaping empty voids. Voids that would have been pitch black were it not for the faint merlot hue of the flesh within. He was at least a foot taller than me, which did nothing to help the sudden onset of knee-buckling panic. I passed out eventually. The goatee on his otherwise smooth face was distended, stretched around something held beneath his pursed lips. Consciousness left me the moment they peeled apart. Staring down at me from between his white teeth was a pair of socketless, blood-soaked eyeballs. By the time I came to, the police were already poking around the flat. Ted and Lisa had hoisted me onto the couch after Ted, who was luckily drunk off his ass, smashed a bottle over the eye-eaten man's head and phoned 999. I was offered an ambulance, but I declined. After hearing how drunk Ted handled the situation, I felt much safer with him than I would have done at a hospital. Part of me wanted to move out after that, as you can imagine. Part of me still wishes I had. As it was, I instead resolved that I wasn't going to let Roy or his disturbed followers ruin the first living space I'd ever picked out and signed a contract for. Over the Christmas break, we all agreed that once we returned, we were kicking Roy out. Thing is, the police hadn't found anything they could use to arrest him. They had found a book, a manuscript draft, which they'd confiscated, but, again, couldn't find anything incriminating enough inside to warrant not returning it. One concerned police officer had told Lisa this via email. They'd warned her that while there was nothing they could pin on Roy, that all three of us should be cautious. I'm sure the officer risked getting fired by saying this, but she'd very bluntly stated, I almost guarantee I'm going to be called back to that flat soon, and I'm worried that next time the mutilation won't be self-inflicted. I can't tell you why, but this is just all wrong. Please, Ms. Pearson, your boyfriend and your flatmate should find alternative accommodation as soon as possible. It was the book that worried them. I've since seen it, of course, but when Lisa forwarded me on that initial email, all I had to go by was the title. Ha 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 ha. The children are bleeding. A housewife's tale. During those last 3 months after we ignored the officer's advice and returned to the flat we shared with Roy, I'd come to know that book much, much better. It had clearly made an impression on some of the police officers because I noticed more than one high-vis jacket knock on the door and lead themselves through to Roy's room. I'd hear Lisa crying about it at night when I was too afraid of the low mumblings coming from the direction of Roy on the other side of the wall between our bedrooms to sleep. She was terrified, and I'll be honest, so was I. Trying to kick Roy out hadn't gone well. We'd managed to keep ourselves composed for a full month of the new term before Lisa finally snapped. She marched down the hallway, banging on Roy's door with her fists. You come out here. Right now, Roy. Bide quiet. You smelly, creepy bastard. I've fucking had enough. You've got to fucking leave now. Ted and I didn't have enough time to put down Tekken and head out into the hallway. By the time our PS4 controllers touched the ground, Lisa was backing into the living room, palms outstretched, pleading with the slowly advancing group of glazed-eyed acolytes. The 10 or so strong crowd was just as mismatched as ever. There was a pot-bellied policeman, a mother and teenage daughter with matching get me the manager haircuts, a clearly homeless man whose breath stank of white lightning, a woman in a crisp grey suit with a big name, Banks. Hi, my name is Badge. Still above her breast pocket, a normally unremarkable group of people, all rendered terrifying by the hateful expressions in their glass eyes, and the short figure in the dark coat they parted to let through. Roy was looking worse than ever. His skin was near translucent now. Dark blue veins crisscrossed the skin of his temples and around his eyes. His eyes themselves were milky red, more burst capillaries. Now than anything else, his thin lips, were smirking at Lisa, but his bag-buried eyes shared the hate of his followers. Oh, I'm leaving, am I, Lisa? His words were slow, deliberate, the tone so measured and controlled it seemed like forming each syllable took him a conscious effort. Yes, Lisa stammered, bumping into the kitchen table and yelping. Yes, you've got to get out. I'm sick of all the smell and these freaks. She spat the last word out, her anger somehow finding the strength to rise above her terror. The freaks found her defiance amusing. They began laughing in soft chuckles, each perfectly timed with Roy's own. "Cute, Lisa, that's cute." His smirk grew, although it did falter when Ted stepped between them. "Back off, Roy. I don't care how many of your sick little club you've got with you. If you lay a finger on her, I'll fuck you up." I was still standing behind them, so I couldn't see his face, but the fury in Ted's roar was enough to make even me jump. That's why Roy's unflinching response shook me to the core. "I'm already fucked up, Theodore. So are all of you. I'm just honest about it." He scanned the three of us with his sunken eyes. "I'm fond of two of you, so I'm going to ignore this transgression. Don't disturb me when I'm working again." He and his followers shot Lisa one last disgusted look, then retreated back down the dark hallway into Roy's bedroom. That night's wall-muffled sermon lasted well into dawn hours. So did Lisa's sobs. I didn't see Roy again until the night of the fire. I was still defiantly refusing to leave. Lisa had tried, but for some reason Ted talked her out of it. She moved into his bedroom, leaving her old one as an empty space. As for Ted, he was still convinced he could end all of this at a moment's notice by giving Roy a black eye. I think he was just as scared as we were and found the macho fantasy comforting. I don't think any of us could have moved out though, not really. Firstly because I doubt Roy would have let us, and secondly because the thought of leaving him and his followers to their own devices was somehow even more terrifying. It became clear to me that last month that I'd have to intervene. Even though I was terrified, I couldn't just let the situation develop. Evil triumphs when good men do nothing, or whatever the quote is. It took me 4 weeks to build the courage to step up, but I knew I couldn't live with myself if, well, you'll see. Roy's followers were up to something. That became apparent over the next few nights following the confrontation in the kitchen. I'd lay awake listening as the muffled sermons became intertwined with dull thuds and scrapes, banging and hammering, the grinding of saws on wood. After a week, the muted sounds of work started coming from Lisa's old bedroom too. I didn't have many opportunities to talk to her about it though. She rarely left her room during those last weeks. Ted had a job tending a bar, and so would be out most evenings. He'd return after midnight with the sounds of heavy activity always starting when he was out the house, or, as I could tell because of the thin walls, snoring. He was working the night on the fire, which I think is the only reason he was still around to knock those 2 pointless years off my sentence. The first thing I noticed on the night of the fire was the stampeding of boots. I'd got used to hearing them traipsing up and down the hallway outside my room in the night hours. Learned to somehow sleep despite the heavy footfalls that grew louder as they approached the other side of my bedroom door, staying silent until they'd thump back towards Roy's room when the sun rose. Hearing the heavy thumps of the dozen or so pairs of feet leave the flat and slam the door behind them was new. I should have been relieved. I wasn't though. I still remembered the man with the eyes in his mouth, the police officer's warning was still in my memory too. Wherever Roy's followers had gone, it can't have been to do anything good. I assumed Roy had gone with them when I found his bedroom empty. A quick peek beyond my own bedroom door showed me I wasn't being guarded. I did knock on Lisa's door, but there was no response. She was sleeping, I guessed. Must be, since I couldn't hear her crying. I didn't have much reason to check Lisa's old room at that point. Instead, I tried Roy's door, tentatively, but hopeful I could catch him alone without his acolytes. I still thought I could get through to him, just as Ted was holding on to the fantasy of control through masculine violence. I was still banking on the fact that Roy was my friend who was ill, my friend who was ill that could be reasoned with, got through to, helped. When I learned the truth, I found out just how terrible a judge of character I'd been when I chose a friend in Roy. I also discovered my naive ideas about salvation and healing were pitifully misguided. When I found the book on the desk of his empty room, I realised Roy didn't need a friend. He needed an executioner. The lump in my throat was already building when his bedroom door swung open. I'd already knocked it once, and not hard. The rickety wood moved almost of its own accord, like it was inviting me in. The room beyond was lit only by a small lamp on Roy's desk. I didn't notice that immediately. However, the first sensory feedback to hit me was from my nose. The stench of gasoline and burnt eggs was noxious. I had to raise my t-shirt over my nose, although it did little to smother the fumes. I headed over to the book on the desk, because in all honesty, I think that's what Roy wanted me to do. This was all part of his game, I think. I guess he must have misjudged it. It didn't end the way he'd planned. At least, I hope it didn't. From what I read in my brief skin of the book, though it wouldn't surprise me at all if that twisted genius had planned for me to do everything I did after I'd managed to stop vomiting. It was a printed volume, bound in a red cover, empty, save for the title. Ha ha ha, the children are bleeding, a housewife's tale. The front and odd typography were almost as disconcerting as the fact I had to open the front cover to confirm this was indeed the book written by R. Bardiquite. These inconsistencies with publishing norms were nothing compared to the contents, though. I'm not going to go into details, because writing it out would just be recreating it. I managed about 5 or 6 pages before my diaphragm contracted, and the inside of my t-shirt was filled with warm bile. I threw Roy's twisted book across the room, pulling off my shirt to wipe away my puke. I was jabbing away tears welling in my eyes. I don't have a word for my emotional state. Panicked, terror-stricken, insane. None do justice to the depth of the fear that overtook me from reading those few pages. What I can tell you is that it was a stream of untitled passages, some poetry, others prose. They described the most abominable things. Well, I don't want to say that you could imagine, because I genuinely don't believe you can. I hope you can't. Unspeakable acts, twisted creatures, horrifying landscapes, All were laid out in verse and text by Roy with such clarity and poise they could not have possibly have been purely from the imagination. This is when my resolve that I had to intervene solidified. In the moments I was wiping the last of the puke from my lips. I didn't want to know what the kind of people who, unrepulsed by this book, are capable of. Roy on his own was clearly dangerous. A following devoted to whatever twisted message his magnum opus conveyed was unthinkable. The open cardboard box I then noticed on Roy's bed, the one full of copies of the same scarlet volume I'd hurled against the wall, was the last straw. I'd never been happier that Ted had an affinity for Zippos. I mean, that we had a few canisters of lighter fluid in one of the kitchen's cupboards. Along with the half a dozen bottles of vodka, I had more than enough to do what I needed. I was about to light the match I'd swiped from a drawer in Roy's desk and ignite his bedroom when I heard the whimper. Lisa? I'd been so caught up in the terror-induced mad fervour that I'd completely forgotten about her. She hadn't made a sound up until that point, despite me yelling at the top of my lungs as I threw vodka and lighter fluid across every inch of Roy's floor and the hallway outside. I could still hear her whimpering when I at last managed to kick through the door to her and Ted's shared room. The door burst inwards to reveal a screaming Lisa, nowhere in the room beyond. Her terrified now shrieks weren't stopping though. It was then I realised they'd never been coming from her new bedroom. They were coming from her old one. The door to Lisa's old bedroom, the one Roy's followers had been using, didn't need kicking. I didn't even need to knock. It creaked ajar as I walked towards it. The room beyond was unlit, but I knew Lisa was in there. Her screams grew noticeably louder. The instant an inch of darkness was visible between the door frame. The light from the hall cast a long beam on the dark floor. It ended at Lisa's feet. Even with that little detail, I knew straight away that her screams were warranted. The light from the open doorway illuminated her feet, ankles and up to her knees. She was unclothed, strapped with thick leather belts to a wooden X. Well, an X is the easiest way to describe it. I wouldn't see the full horror of the device until a few moments later when I switched the light on. When I did see the full majesty of the infernal contraption, my attention was directed elsewhere, so I still don't clearly remember exactly how it was. What I do remember is that the heavy wooden X had ornate diagrams carved on every inch of it. It was nailed into a rotating mass of cogs and wheels, all engraved with the same intricate and unnerving pictograms. These wheels were made from a range of materials, from iron and different grains of wood through to plastic, papier-mâché and animal bone. As I said though, when I switched on the light, my attention wasn't on the spinning wheels and their arcane symbols. It was on Lisa. I can see you. Oh God, Rick, I can see you. How can I see you, Rick? I screamed the moment the light switch removed the blanket of darkness. I could see the full extent of the contraption she was strapped to, how it took up almost the whole room. I saw how it was connected to bubbling vats of God knows what, 2 pipes and valves that hissed, reeking steam. The burnt egg and gasoline smell was so thick that layers of phlegm built on each panicked breath. How I didn't pass out, I don't know. Well, I do. I think I was too scared of Lisa's eyes to pass out. My body simply could not allow itself to shut down and be vulnerable in the presence of her gaze. She was strapped to the machine. Her eyes, the ones I remembered, were hidden behind a thick bandage wrapped tightly around her head. I wept when I saw the two dark red patches above their location. My head filled with flashbacks to the man in the hallway. I can see you, Rick. I can see you, Rick. I can see you, Rick. I can see you. I knew how she could see me, although I didn't have the words to explain it to her. To be fair to myself, even if I did, I had no remaining sanity with which to form them. Lisa was watching me with her new eyes. They lined every inch of her naked body. They were sewn on with crude stitches, lids and all, the surrounding skin removed from the faces of their original owners. Owners, I realised with a growing horror, were probably on the streets that moment, their eyeless, hollow faces hidden beneath hoods and sunglasses as they distributed Roy's foul techniques to the unsuspecting world. That wasn't the worst part though. The worst part was that the dozens of transplanted eyes were still blinking. Rick, how can I see you? What's happening? Rick, I'm scared. Lisa was screaming rapid fire pleas at me. She was struggling and tugging against the binds. I couldn't count how many eyes were on her arm, legs, midriff, chest, back, neck, groin, hips, hands, everywhere, registering that they were all staring at me, all blinking and tracking me around the room, while Lisa continued to beg me to explain how her bound face wasn't blind was enough for me to snap. I hate myself for my cowardice, but I slammed the door shut. I tried to block out Lisa's wails as I lifted the match, my bottom lip trembling and vision swimming with tears. I told you I was working on something. I turned. Slowly, Roy was standing at the other end of the hallway between me and the kitchen, living room, and most importantly, the front door. I tensed, ready to fight for my life. Then to my surprise, he stood aside. Go ahead, Rick. He was smiling at me. To my horror, it was the same warm smile he had had during those first few months of our first year, before the incident which set this chain of events in motion. He continued his overly measured words, soft and reassuring, in a way that sent a shiver down my spine. I'm not going to try and stop you. This is always how your part in the story ends, every time. I didn't look behind me when I shut the door to the flat. Last I saw Roy, he was sat on the chair in the living room, chuckling softly to himself, while the burnt egg and gasoline smell was replaced by thick smoke. I could hear Lisa's shrieks as I ran down the street. I turned to allow myself a quick glance. The last I saw was neighbours stepping out onto their front gardens, smoke billowing from the windows above the shop, the shopkeeper below yelling frantically into his phone. None of that troubled me. The only thing that did in the last few moments I spent on that street was that even above the screams of both Lisa and the neighbours, I could still hear Roy's laughter. I handed myself into the police immediately. I didn't want Ted to get pinned for this. and after what I'd seen, normal life wasn't an option. How could I settle in a job, a life, a family, when every time I closed my eyes I could see a swarm of them on a naked woman's body staring back at me? He didn't deserve to have his life ruined though. He'd already lost Lisa. He didn't deserve to lose himself too. That's also why I lied to him about what happened. As far as Ted knows, Roy slit her throat. The police and jury didn't buy that, neither did the judge. But Ted did, and that's all I care about. That's why I can finally write this out, get this out into the world. Ted passed away yesterday. Tragic, but completely unrelated. Cancer. From what he had told me during his visits over the years, he'd managed to move on, settle down, have kids. I'm glad. It made it worth it in a way. If I hadn't acted when I did, it would have been Ted a few weeks later. Now, there's no risk of him finding out the truth. I can be open. I can tell the world the real side of my story. The timing also isn't fully accidental either. I've told a couple of the other inmates hear my story, the true story. Usually they laugh, say it's bullshit, but enjoy the good yarn nonetheless. Last week though, one of the new guys didn't laugh. He grabbed me after, started whispering to me in hushed tones. You know Roy's book, the little red volume I thought I'd burned all known copies of. He'd seen it. I knew he wasn't lying too, because he was able to recite to me the exact same paragraph I refused to write down earlier. If there are still copies out there, then burning Roy and Lisa alive was for nothing. My life behind bars was all for naught. I already know Roy brought more than one police officer into the fold. I don't know how long this post will stay up, because I don't know how deep this goes. Please warn everyone you know. Tell them to stay away from any red book with an odd title, especially one called Ha Ha Ha, The Children Are Bleeding, a Housewife's Tale. If any of your friends or family start acting strange, going to odd meetings in the dead of night, they refuse to disclose details of, tell them my story. If they do anything other than laugh, run. Don't stop. They're already one of them. It's too late. I thought I'd kept you all safe from this. I fucked up. I'm sorry. I've used all of my accrued good behaviour, internet privileges, to get this warning out there. The night of the fire, I did something unspeakable and threw my life away so that you could carry on living yours in safety. Get my message out. Please make my sacrifice worth it. Make sure nobody reads anything by Roy Bardaquet. I just hope he's actually dead. It's getting harder to forget that they never found his body. And that's it for tonight, my little hellhounds. Thank you for listening. If you liked these scary stories, then don't forget to click that like button and subscribe, and click the bell icon so you get notified every time I upload. If you have any scary stories you want narrated on the channel, then submit them to Reddit r/homeofscares and follow me on Twitter at homeofscares. Now, good night, my little hellhounds.